This is Morbid, the Seven Acolytes, a top-down 2D Souls-like, actually, where you play as the last surviving striver, basically a lifelong trained warrior that is meant to go to the mainland and defeat these evil things called the Seven Acolytes. And they are effectively Lovecraftian sort of cosmic horror deities given flesh. The Gahars, they are called. You never really see them exactly in their normal forms, presumably because you could not handle it, but the Acolytes are basically their mortal shells, and that's your job, to go throughout this cursed land and rid it of the curse by destroying the Acolytes, because without their shells, the Gahars cannot exist. And if a game like Salt and Sanctuary was going for the, as direct a 2D translation to Dark Souls as there was at the time, then this is basically going for the same thing for Bloodborne, complete with all the gore, the Lovecraftian sort of cosmic horror story background and everything. This is very much inspired by games like Bloodborne and, of course, others in the Soulsborne/Souls-like genre, so it is, of course, in very pleasant company with all sorts of hardcore RPGs. So as for this one, you can already tell just by looking at it that it is very pixely, but the pixel art in this game is very detailed. It looks really nice, actually. I'm just a fan in general of pixel art because it can be done in so many different ways. Some ways are really nice, some ways I'm not a huge fan of, but it really just depends on the aesthetic they're going for. But in this case, the art style is really nice because there's a lot of detail. They are not super chunky pixels, but rather quite small, much more detailed ones with really nice animations, actually, and importantly, really nice environment art, because this game is very heavily focused on the exploration around the areas, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and also a focus on just sort of getting the horror aspect across with the super goriness of everything. There's a lot of gore, a lot of blood in this game, and the bosses and various enemies you face are pretty horrifying in that sort of like Castlevania Symphony of the Night / Salt and Sanctuary kind of way. So there are just big mounds of corpses and flesh and horrible things all around the place, and it is of course your job to put them down. The whole aesthetic does a really good job in general of making the whole thing just feel uncomfortable and gross and bloody and weird. Like I said, this is a very gory game, and the bosses in particular really do a good job of showing that. In case in point, the boss in the background right now. Have you ever wanted to fight a boss that is an undead sort of mayoress using her presumably stillborn fetus on the end of an umbilical cord as a flail against you? Because if you've ever wanted to do that, then, well, I have the game for you. All of the enemies are pretty weird, and the bosses, of course, being the prime amongst them, are often pretty disturbing. And one thing the game does that I really like is it actually makes you sort of execute the bosses, because one aspect of the whole cosmic horror story thing that is, I feel, not touched on enough in games that try it is that whole delving into the maw of madness and becoming not so human yourself, but just sort of trying to survive. And sometimes that doesn't come across so well because they keep a little bit too much of their morality intact, whereas the original, like, Lovecraftian heroes weren't really heroes at all, and in fact often ended up gibbering messes at the end of their journeys. And this game does a good job of doing that sort of side of the cosmic horror story thing a little bit better. And one aspect of that is after you kill a boss, they don't just fall over when their health gauge empties, they have some sort of post-battle thing that they say to you, and then you actually have to kill them yourself. And they usually die in a pretty bloody, horrible way, as you would expect, and then their corpses actually sit there for the rest of the game. So if you return for any reason to the arena where you fought them, they'll still be there, just kind of chilling, rotting away. Mechanically, it'll be pretty familiar to you if you've played any Souls-likes before, and but it does have a couple of interesting differences. So one is that, as you would expect, stamina management in combat is very important, the stamina gauge being sort of the primary language of combat for games like this. You have to be careful not to use too much stamina so that you can dodge away. You, of course, have a dodge roll as well as a sprint, a series of light attack combos, and every weapon also has a heavy attack. But this is a little bit different than the standard method of, like, light versus heavy attack, because in this case, the heavy attack is a single attack, not a combo, and it takes a very long time to wind up, but it does huge amounts of damage. And there are quite a few different weapons in this game, each with their own sort of eccentricities, different damage types, different combos, and the heavy attack tends to be quite different for each of them. They can, of course, be things like just big swipes or very long-range sort of blows, but they can also have some special characteristics like firing certain projectiles or causing spikes to erupt along the ground, things like that. If your weapon has some sort of magical characteristic, then it tends to come out during the heavy attack. But you have to be kind of careful when using it because it takes such a long time to wind up on purpose because of how powerful they are, and if you get hit, you do get interrupted. So the combat is very much as you'd expect for a game like this, very heavily stamina-based, with trying to be careful not to use too much and to commit too much to an attack so that you still have some stamina left over to roll away when the boss inevitably counterattacks. And it also does have a parry, although not a block, interestingly enough, because the parry kind of acts as both. If you press the left bumper, you will hold up your weapon for just a second, and it will act as a block and block most or all of the damage depending on the attack that you're blocking. But if you do it just at the right time, it will turn into a parry. And you can counterattack for huge damage, of course, as you would expect if you pull that off right. The timing is pretty specific on this because the block doesn't last for very long. It's just like a second-long little animation, and the actual specific timing for turning that block into a parry is it's a very small, narrow amount, as you would expect for a mechanic like that, and it does take a lot of learning to understand how to do it with different enemies' attacks, and of course that's where a lot of the difficulty in a combat system like this comes from, is learning the enemy's attacks, learning your own attacks and your limits with how many attacks you can do before you run out of stamina versus if you need to dodge afterwards versus trying to parry their blows and all that stuff. So it does have the satisfying but traditional, well-weathered Souls-like combat system. In this case, you also do have a ranged weapon that you can equip at the same time, and you have ammo that is not a consumable per se. The ammo actually refills when you go back to the shrines, which act as bonfires, as you would expect. And so they're not actually things that you loot or farm off of enemies. They're instead, you know, things that refresh just like the charges of your healing item and that sort of thing when you go back to a shrine or die. And yeah, so there are all kinds of different ranged weapons as well, like bows, crossbows, even like double-stringed crossbows that fire multiple bolts at once, shotguns, sort of blunderbuss-style weapons, rifles, pistols, and all of the firearm-style weapons are actually gas-powered, which is an interesting aspect of the what they're calling horrorpunk aesthetic that the game goes for, which from what I can tell is sort of like a combination of like cosmic horror plus steampunk, more or less, which actually works pretty well in the game's favor. The game does have that very strange, uncomfortable atmosphere going for it that has been deliberately crafted to be just sort of creepy in general, and I really enjoy that sort of thing, so I'm a fan. And you also have your various consumable items. You can map 4 of them to the D-pad, and you can hold as many as your inventory will hold if you want as well. So you have your sort of Estus Flask-like healing item. You also have shrooms, which are basically like the bundles, like the pine resin bundles from Dark Souls that add damage to your weapons, although they actually add that element to both the ranged and melee weapon that you have equipped. You can also equip 2 different sets of weapons that you can quickly switch between in your inventory, which I would recommend doing even if you don't want to necessarily use the other one right now, because it saves space in your inventory, which is quite limited. And all your various restorative items, other healing consumables that aren't your charge-based one, and you know, status curing stuff, all that sort of stuff is in here exactly as you would expect. Even the little canister there that actually refills your ammo, since it's gas ammo, it comes from a canister. I've noticed that a lot of the consumables also have a sort of positive and negative aspect, which is sort of fun. You know, you might find one that restores your health over time but drains your stamina for a little while, or one that restores your sanity but drains your health a little bit. Sanity is another thing that I should probably mention. That purple bar on the left side of the screen, that is just damaged by getting hit by horrible things, but there are also various enemies that do specific sanity draining attacks that will only hurt you a little bit but will drain a lot more of your sanity. These are usually pretty obvious because they have like a purple glow to them, just like your meter, so it's generally clear that that's what they do. And the game is a little bit tight-lipped with some of its mechanics as to what some of it does, and sanity is one of those things. The only thing it actually tells you is that sanity affects the number of phantoms you'll encounter and your experience gain, but it doesn't tell you exactly what that means. I have encountered what I assume are the phantoms, but only once in a boss fight, and they seem to kind of be part of the boss fight, so I'm not sure if it was low sanity causing that or not, because I've never seen them otherwise. And also, I don't know exactly what it means by experience gain. Like, do you get more experience if you maintain high sanity because you can understand what you're doing more, or do you get more experience if you let your sanity sink low and risk running into these phantoms? I actually don't know, it doesn't tell you, but it apparently does, at least in some respect, affect your experience gain. Which leads us to the character building aspect. This is a lot different than a traditional Souls-like does it. There are no stats that you put points into, and in fact there's no like currency that you get for killing enemies or anything, like blood echoes or souls or anything like that, or salt. Instead, you get experience. That brain in the top left corner, you can see that sort of orange and gray background behind it filling up as you kill enemies. That's experience, and when it fills up you will get a skill point, which is the gray diamond with a 0 next to it right below the brain. And these skill points can be spent at the shrines to upgrade blessings, which is sort of interesting. That means you don't actually give yourself permanent stats, but rather you will eventually come across these praying statues that you can break, and each one will contain a blessing. And these are permanent upgrades, but you only have a certain number of slots that you can equip, so you have to change your sort of blessing loadout by going to a shrine and slotting the ones that you want to use into the active slots that you have out of all the ones that you have found so far. And these blessings can do simple things like making your health gauge longer, making your stamina recharge more quickly, to other things like making it harder for enemies to detect you, or even making your melee attacks swing faster, stuff like that. There are all kinds of different blessings. When you first gain access to that system, you will have 2 slots, so you can choose up to 2 of the blessings that you've found so far, but every time you kill one of the Acolytes, one of the major bosses, you will get another slot. So that's the main method of character progression, and these skill points are spent to upgrade the effect of every blessing. Every blessing has 5 levels, and each level costs that number of skill points. So level 1 costs 1, level 2 costs 2, all the way up to 5, so that means you will need 15 skill points if you want to max out one of the blessings to level 5, where it will provide the strongest effect that it can. I think this is a pretty cool method of character progression because although it's not as nitty-gritty, not as detailed as actually having a huge stats page to put points into, it still gets the overall point across of, being able to build your character for different things by equipping these different blessings. And it also makes changing what your character is built for at any given time a lot easier because you don't have to respec, you just simply go to a shrine and then equip different blessings in the slots to make yourself geared for something else, which is pretty cool. The world of the game is actually huge. Like, it's genuinely a very large handmade world, and the areas also do a good job of bleeding into each other before you transition to the next area. So you don't just go from a forest to a castle with no indication that you are going from one to the other. As you get close to a new environment, the aspects of that new environment will be present in the one you're currently in a little bit so that you're aware you're moving towards a new place, which is important when it comes to 2D exploration because in a 3D game like Dark Souls and Bloodborne in this case, you simply look to where you're going and you can see in general what the next area is going to be like and you can sort of plan your route to it. But of course in a 2D game you can only see as far as the borders of the screen. You can't actually see that far ahead of you. So in a game that is this large with this much stuff to explore, it's really nice that they made a good effort to actually make these areas flow into each other relatively intuitively so that as you're exploring around, you will know that you're coming across an entrance soon or some sort of new environment soon because it will become clear that you're sort of transitioning from one biome to the next. And the areas are fitting. Some of them are kind of horrifying, gross swamps, creepy old spooky forests, weird sort of ruined experimental looking facilities, old castles, all sorts of stuff like that. Really cool gardens with like stone ruins all along them. The areas fit the sort of horrorpunk theme, and in fact there is even like a creepy steampunk city, and the addition of NPCs here and there help to kind of draw that whole horrorpunk thing, because a lot of these NPCs don't really like you that much, but they also don't attack you, and they just seem kind of consigned to what's happening, as tends to be the case in like that sort of cosmic horror story idea. A lot of people just don't really know exactly what they're up against and know that any sort of resistance is a bad idea, so they're just sort of going along hoping to go unnoticed by the horrible cosmic entities, effectively. And anyone that tries to make themselves known, even if it's because they're trying to be a hero, is generally considered kind of an idiot. And that's you. You are the idiot in this case that is going against the horrible unknown beings from beyond the stars. Congratulations. Overall, I actually think it's really solid. The combat is satisfying. The collection of weapons is pretty varied, and the ranged weapons help with that. I like the blessing system. I like the stamina management being very important in combat, which is sort of inherent to the genre, but not all games get that right, so it's nice to see. I love the cosmic horror story aspect, and the sort of horror punk thing they're going for is really fun. The overall just grossness and goriness of everything is really cool because it pervades every aspect of the game. Everything is gross and bloody and awesome. I love it. But if I had to come up with a couple of criticisms, one would be kind of a victim of its own success sort of idea, because the areas are so good to explore and there's so much stuff to find in them, including like whole sections that I almost missed that had an entire side quests and optional bosses and new blessings and stuff in them. Because the world is just worth exploring and so vast and kind of maze-like, the fact that the game doesn't have a map is kind of a big deal because it makes finding NPCs or shrines or just areas or knowing what parts of the area you haven't been to yet kind of difficult sometimes because they're so huge. So the fact that the game lacks a map is kind of a big deal to me because it's so maze-like sometimes, and it would be really nice to have a map, even if it was kind of like a simple map, or maybe it used like Hollow Knight rules where the map only updated in kind of a sketchy way whenever you came to a new shrine or something. Something like that would still be really nice, because there's even one side quest that I genuinely cannot turn in because I cannot find the NPC to turn it in. I did all the optional stuff to complete it, and even after having done all that work, now I can't find the NPC that actually gave me the quest in the first place because I have no idea where they are, and the lack of a map doesn't help. Compounding this problem is the fact that the fast travel system is kind of weird. Normally in games like this, the shrines or whatever act kind of like bonfires are your fast travel points. And when you fast travel to a new area, you go to the shrine that you choose in that area. But in this case, they don't quite work that way. You still unlock new fast travel zones by claiming new shrines, but when you fast travel, you don't go to the shrine that claimed that area, you go to the entrance to that area, which may or may not be anywhere near the shrine, which is kind of weird and a bit disorienting, and because of that lack of a map, it can sometimes make getting your bearings in some of the larger areas a bit more difficult than it needs to be. And that also means that sometimes you will access 2 or 3 shrines in a row that do not actually give you new fast travel areas. Like, for instance, there's a huge forest area that has like 5 shrines in it, but only the very first one and the very last one give you new fast travel locations in that entire place. The rest of it is just this big maze-like forest, and none of the shrines that you activate there actually allow you to sort of save your progress exploration-wise. It still saves the game, obviously, but you can't fast travel back there. You have to walk there from one of the other teleportation points. So yeah, that's just kind of weird, and I'm not a huge fan of the idea that the world is so massive and maze-like with no map. It makes finding your way around kind of tricky. The other main criticism I have is that the inventory management is kind of a chore. You have a grid-based inventory, and it does not shuffle itself around when you go to pick something up. Like games like, say, Path of Exile that also have grid-based inventories, if you have some space to make room for whatever you want to pick up, your inventory will automatically shuffle itself to open up that room for you when you go to pick something up. But this game doesn't do that, so you have to manually shuffle all your crap around all the time in order to make room for new stuff, and your inventory is quite small. The other thing is there doesn't seem to be an item box or a storage chest of any kind, so that you have to leave a lot of good stuff behind. One of the fun aspects of games like this is collecting all the various cool boss loot and stuff like that, and there's some really cool loot to find in this with some really fun weapons, but because your inventory is so small and there's no way to permanently store items besides to keep them on you, you have to leave a lot of that cool loot behind because you can't put it anywhere else and you only have so much room. So that's a bit weird. It kind of feels like a missed opportunity to have some sort of like shrine storage box or something. But overall, like I said, besides some of the smaller problems I have, the game itself is very much worth playing. It is a really solid, very atmospheric and creepy and unsettling and genuinely good attempt at the cosmic horror thing, which is sometimes hard to do right kind of game. And it does a good job of having satisfying combat, really fun boss fights, and some really cool areas to explore. So I recommend it, honestly. You can pick this up tomorrow, actually, the 3rd of December. If you want to check it out, the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam page so that you can do that. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.